This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz on modernism, traditionalism, postmodernism. So following World War II, America became a world leader in science and technology. We oftentimes refer to this as modernism, and the reason why it's referred to as modernism is because there's a focus on rationality, science, and using rationality and science in order to gain progress. So why did America become so powerful after World War II? One of the reasons has to do with the end of World War II. America had a monopoly on the atomic bomb, and that gave us U.S. leadership in the world. But we also had such a strong leadership presence because of our economic policies. The United States established Keynesianism on a global basis at this point. They applied this through the creation of two major institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund. Just a reminder on this, the International Monetary Fund establishes rules by which developing countries can get loans from the World Bank to then go out and modernize their economy. There was a shared consensus at this time period the best way to run overall economics was to have what was called a technocratic leadership, meaning you would have experts who were well prepared in things like science and in economic leadership in order to give practical types of results in order to have economic progress. The 1950s era of affluence. So it appeared that all of this was really working out pretty well. In the 1950s, the American economy was the leader of the world. The Bretton Woods Conference that established the IMF and the World Bank pegged all other currencies to the dollar. And during this time period between international trade and domestic growth, the American economy grew regularly by 5 to 6% GDP. To give you some kind of reference point to judge that by, a really good GDP growth is usually around 4%. Right now, we're not having the best GDP growth. We're about at 2%. So 5 to 6% GDP on a regular basis is an incredibly strong economy. Now, there were some recessions. There were 3 of them during the 1950s, but the 3 recessions were very small. And during that time period, most people experienced overall growth as they moved into suburban centers. Because of this growth of the economy, there was a development of what is known as the youth culture. Remember, the United States had mandated after World War II that children below the age of 17 had to attend school. By doing this, what we were doing was 2 different things. One, we were teaching children skills for the long term, especially in the context of the Cold War, so this allowed us to train children, especially in math and science. The other big purpose of doing this was to, in essence, warehousing the children in order to teach them skills for the long term. What this ended up doing, though, was to create a market for advertisers. What I mean by this is now you have all these kids who are basically stuck in schools. It creates their own culture. And I know it may sound strange, like how does this really create a culture by housing children in schools? But actually it does. If you think about it, in the past, children of this age were out in farmlands. They were out in factories. They were out in coal mines. Now we had actually created a whole new set of children who we called teenagers who could then be marketed to. And companies did this. They did it through 2 ways. One was through consumer goods, and the other was through the new rock and roll industry. Rock and roll had come out of a development of mixing together different musical sounds like blues, ragtime, and soul. Some of the big artists were Elvis Presley and many of the artists who functioned under the Motown industries. What had happened here was that there was a creation of a youth time culture that could then be appealed to by advertisers in order to spend consumer dollars. Now, in the midst of all this great affluence and the development of this middle-class culture, especially the youth culture, there was still a questioning of overall poverty in America. At the time, there was a man named Michael Harrington, who was a socialist, who wrote a book called The Other America. And he actually found that about 34.6 million Americans lived in what government defined as being poverty. 40% of these people were below the age of 18. He began calling out for federal action to eliminate poverty since the states were not acting. Also, there was a challenge brought by a radical sociologist named Wright Mills. He was a sociologist in the 1950s, and he argued that the big problem amidst all this incredible societal affluence was that the government had formed too close of a cooperation between the military, the industry, and government. He called this the military-industrial complex. He argued that these interest groups had created a way that turned us away from being a republic. Instead, what we had thought was a republic, because we went out and voted, had now become sort of a technocratic elite that were guiding the country through military, industry, and government. The impact was that the people's vote had become more of just a formality, and it didn't really have a strong influence over government. Strangely enough, this was echoed by the conservative President Eisenhower. When he left office in his farewell address in 1960, he made a very similar point in which he argued from a conservative point of view that we suffered from the possibility of an military-industrial complex in which people would no longer have influence over the government, but it would rather be these bureaucratic and technocratic elites. Another major thinker of this time period was Max Weber. Now, Max Weber was actually a German sociologist. He praised the American system for its Protestant work ethic, but at the same time, he provided a warning that was very similar to C. Wright Mills and to Dwight Eisenhower. He argued that America had gone through a transition. We had moved from a farming republic into an industrial state, and this had led to a technocratic management of this industrial state through bureaucrats and experts. It meant that America was becoming more and more distant from its original individual farming past as it formed bureaucracies and technocratic elites run by experts. And this then led into the very radical challenge of the 1950s and 1960s. Probably the leaders of this radical challenge were the beat poets of the 1950s. They were a literary group that challenged the mainstream American culture. Their major themes include anti-materialism, rugged individualism, and risk-taking. Their leader was a man named Jack Kerouac. And now when I say he was a leader, I don't mean that he was a formal leader. In fact, the beat poets would be against formal leadership. But Jack Kerouac wrote a number of books that had huge influence over this small group of young people who challenged the mainstream culture. Kerouac claimed that this overall affluence and this sort of conformity to this leadership that was leading this affluence had led into a materialistic conformity in suburbia. David Reisman also criticized suburbia as a mass culture that had created people believing that as long as they were affluent, that was all that mattered in society, not individualism, not disconformity, not rebelliousness. Allen Ginsberg would even go so far as to challenge heterosexuality itself as a stifling, one-dimensional model of sexuality. Today we have the big argument going on about whether homosexuality is a genetic thing. Allen Ginsberg was not making that argument. That would be an argument that would come up in the 1960s and 1970s by homosexual groups advocating for their rights. Allen Ginsberg actually made the argument that one could choose homosexuality as a way to challenge the heterosexual model that was leading into mass culture in suburbia. Another major challenge, of course, came from the civil rights movement. And there are two phases of the civil rights movement that are going to be important. The first phase of the civil rights movement started in the 1950s, led by Martin Luther King Jr. He stressed integration as a way to break down stereotypes through generations. In other words, if you mix together people of different racial and ethnic groups, eventually people's racism would fall away, because even though they might be racist on a sort of like ideological level, they would start working with people of different races and realizing that most of their racism were basically stereotypes and overgeneralizations. So over time, this would just sort of pass away. He also pursued a nonviolent strategy to use basically white guilt as a way to push reform. The way that this would work is that as African Americans and as white people went out and worked together on a nonviolent strategy, it would expose the evils of racism, especially through the national media, and that would then push the possibility for reform. This actually worked. In 1963, Martin Luther King had a huge success when he led the March on Washington, which resulted in two major federal bills: the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which got rid of discrimination both in private and public facilities, and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which got rid of all the limitations that had been placed upon African Americans in the South in order to vote. But this first phase was going to be challenged. So we typically have in our culture sort of a glorification of the civil rights movement in its first phase. What a lot of people don't realize is after 1964, Martin Luther King himself realized that he had lost control over the civil rights movement. Malcolm X and his legacy had now gained control over the movement. Now, Malcolm X actually was assassinated in 1964, but his legacy was going to take over. X had argued that black people would never have equal power under what he considered to be a white-dominated power structure in America. He called for black separatism and racial solidarity. Now, Malcolm X was killed, but after that, his legacy was picked up in 1964 by a young Stokely Carmichael, who used the legacy of Malcolm X to pursue black pride. He made the argument that separatism and pride were essential in order to make sure that black people could form a solidarity and a network of a community to fight against white racism, both in its overt style and in institutions. That separatism and pride became the basis to other minority movements as well, including AIM, the American Indian Movement, the Radical Women's Movement, and the Brown Berets, which were a group of people very similar to the Black Panthers, but within the Latino community. So all of this leads up now to a radical transformation of modernism. So remember, modernism is this idea that rationality and science can lead to progress, and that all of us together can work towards a more affluent and materialistic society. And by materialism, I don't mean greediness, but materialism in the sense that people's living standards go up, people move into suburbia, and we tend to have this general affluence amongst all people. Postmodernists were going to question that. They questioned what was known as logocentrism, or the grand narrative. In this argument, they argued that modernism had attempted to create universal rules for all people. And by doing that, it robbed people of their local identities and their local culture. Ideology itself became criticized for its use as a tool for unconscious agendas. So what does that mean? So think of the modernist agenda. The modernist agenda is using science in order to create general rules for everybody's affluence. But take a look at what that has led to according to these different challenges. So Wright Mills and President Eisenhower, and then after that, Max Weber, all said, look, rationality can do really good things, but it also leads to a technocratic elite that ends up managing us over these universal rules, which means that we are stolen from our local identities, our ability to control ourselves. That old yeoman farmer past has been taken away from us. And so we sacrifice that for some notion of general affluence. Well, what if there is general affluence? Let's just say that there is for a moment. Even if there is, that means we sacrifice other values, like values of individualism, values of liberty, values of rebelliousness, values of nonconformity. All of that gets sacrificed for general notions of affluence. We get reduced more and more down into just the notion of whether or not we are economically successful. Postmodernists criticized this notion. They criticized rationality as a tool for just bringing everybody in under the same system, integrating all minorities into a system of efficient industrialization, and not allowing for that diversity of thought, diversity of identity. Furthermore, as we know, in the 1970s, the stagnation of the economy would really break down even this notion that we could have general rules of affluence. Remember, Keynesianism had taken over by the 1970s, and everybody thought that this would be the future way by which we could have unending economic progress. But we know that with OPEC in the Middle East cutting back on oil production caused two massive oil shocks and questioned American leadership. Workers began demanding wage increases based upon inflation, and the economy fell into stagflation, having both unemployment and high inflation. Companies began to move abroad in order to compete with other countries around the world and companies around the world. This became known as deindustrialization. America's manufacturing sector was lost as companies began to move to lower costing areas around the world. America began to switch from a manufacturing country to a service-related industry. Now, how does that get connected into postmodernism? In the past, Keynesianism provided for these universal rules of manufacturing. Now, all of a sudden, people were being basically broken into smaller service sector-related industries all around the country. People began working in real estate. They began working in banking as service-related. People began using new types of computer technologies to work out of their homes. All of a sudden now, even the economy was reflecting this notion of local, broken-up, competitive areas, not this notion of universal rules. And this was then seen in the 1970s in cultural politics. So as the civil rights movement advanced, as we were talking about before, we saw a more radical movement. The Black Panthers, for example, were symbolized in Oakland as they switched to racial solidarity in the black community. AIM, the American Indian Movement, was a radical Native American movement that actually at one point took over the island of Alcatraz for a weekend to symbolize the problems for Native Americans. Within the Latino community, the Brown Berets and La Raza argued that Latinos had been portrayed as uncivilized. Now, on the one hand, we had Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez organized farm workers along the lines very similar to Martin Luther King's nonviolent ideal. At the same time, we had a radical movement in the Latino community led by a man named Minister Tejerina, who took control of Kit Carson National Park, based upon a myth known as the Aztlan myth. The idea was a long time ago, Latinos had been organized under the Aztec time period, and it was only when Europeans came in and basically broke that up that they lost their overall identity. Now, whatever you think about these different movements, the bigger point that I want you to see out of this is how the notion of a universal identity was continuously being broken down, and people saw themselves economically fragmented, but also culturally fragmented as well. There was a reaction against this, but the reaction that would be against this would only further cause fragmentation, and that was the religious evangelicals and traditionalism. So religious evangelicals argued that the problem was really a lack of traditional religious values. Now, notice what they're doing here, and this is kind of interesting. Religious evangelicals would argue against modernism and postmodernism, but in some ways they became supportive of postmodernism. Not explicitly, but they would become supportive of it in the way that they argued. They looked back to the Scopes monkey trial as the problem. This was a trial that took place in the 1920s in favor of evolution. And what they argued was that over time, American popular culture had equated humans with animals. If we're the product of evolution, then we're the same as all other animals. But this had led, in their view, to the notion of relativism, in which basically through evolution, if we're just animals, then there really is no ultimate purpose for us. So everything's relative, everything's dependent upon our perspective. Religious evangelicals then called for a strengthening of religious beliefs. Now, you might think, well, this sounds very universal. It sounds like what the modernists talked about, universal ideas. But what religious evangelicals were arguing was that their viewpoint was just as effective as science. In other words, every viewpoint basically has its own local identity. Science cannot bring us all in under one identity. And this led into a new social conservatism. It was led by some Christian evangelicals, especially probably the most important, a man named Jerry Falwell. He argued the U.S. needed to embrace its Christian values as a biblical country. He called for a return to the traditional values, not science, not modernism, based upon family, hard work, individual responsibility. And he criticized modernism and postmodernism for a lack of a transcendent morality. He also criticized postmodernism for its extreme rationalism and leading up to relativism. And this has led into our cultural political battles that we see happening today. It's called the culture wars. Conservatives and modernists, or postmodernists, battled on a number of issues, women's rights probably being one of the most important. The argument became whether or not there even was a difference between males and females. And what postmodernists and modernists ended up arguing is that there wasn't, that this was all due to gender construction. Probably the key concrete battle was over the famous abortion case known as Roe v. Wade. In 1973, the court split over a woman's pregnancy and defined women's pregnancy as being a part of 3 trimesters. The first trimester, a woman can obtain an abortion on her own because it is believed that this is a fetus, it is not a human child at that point. In the second trimester, the woman must work with a doctor in consultation. And in the third trimester, the woman can only have an abortion in the cases of extreme health problems. Another big issue that would come up, of course, was also the identity of homosexuality itself and its relationship to the family and reproduction. These cultural battles became extremely important, and notice what's happening here. There no longer are universal rules that we can all abide by. Now we are fragmented, and we are broken into different perspectives and relative beliefs about this, depending upon your identity. If you're a religious conservative, you probably believe based upon faith that abortion is wrong, that homosexuality is not a part of traditional marriage. If you're coming from a position of identity for homosexuality, you probably believe that homosexuality is something rooted in genetics and is about sexual identification and therefore should be given tolerance. Jerry Falwell claimed that there was a silent majority who favored traditionalism, and he pointed to what were called the hard hats, working class men who were angered over the fact that young people were using drugs, music, and rebellion in the 1960s. In fact, this group typically had voted for Democrats in the past, but in the 1980s came across and voted for Ronald Reagan. The Reagan Democrats tended to be very conservative, and they came out of that evangelical background or Catholic background, and they wanted women to remain in the home. They believed in traditional marriage, and they believed in the importance of families raising children. Bill Clinton became the symbol then for people on the evangelical side to point out why the 1960s and modernism and postmodernism were so wrong. In 1992, Clinton won the election claiming it's really the economy, stupid. And then, right after that, he was able to get past Don't Ask, Don't Tell. This was where Clinton made a compromise in which he made the argument that gay people should be able to serve in the military. After that, Clinton was involved in the sex scandal with Monica Lewinsky in the late 1990s. The question about Clinton's perjury over the trial and his sexual harassment and his support of homosexuals serving in the military allowed conservatives to make the claim that Clinton was the primary example of why we had such a problem in the culture, that this was a demonstration of how modernism and postmodernism had led to a relativism of morality and allowed for sexual immorality to flow even at the level of presidential politics. And so when George Bush came into office, he promoted pretty explicitly the idea of an evangelical Christianity that would run the country even from the presidency's office. This was very different from what we had seen in conservatives in the past. George Bush openly talked about his evangelical Protestantism. He even talked at one point about how God had placed him into the office of the presidency. And there seemed to be this hope amongst evangelical Christians that the Bush presidency would bring us back to traditionalism, away from modernism, away from postmodernism. In fact, George Bush had an advisor named Karl Rove who used the issue of homosexuality in local elections to drive a wedge between voters. They would make sure that there were actual laws being placed in local state areas about the issue of gay marriage in order to try to bring out traditionalists in order to vote for Republicans. Bush at the same time tried to lighten the image of conservatism through something known as compassionate conservatism. But notice what this was about. Government would provide financial aid to religious institutions doing charitable work. Notice what President Bush was doing here. He was having the government get involved in welfare, but through religious organizations. This was an attempt to bring out and strengthen traditionalist organizations in the country. However, with the problems that the Bush administration faced, it opened up the possibility for an alternative to be set. And we are seeing that today. Since Obama has come into the office, the younger population, people in their 20s and 30s, have really challenged traditionalism yet once again. People seem to be more accepting of homosexuality within their 20s and 30s. This eventually allowed for President Obama to end the order on Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and to allow gay people to serve openly in the military. Also, Obama switched his own beliefs on gay marriage, claiming at the beginning of his presidency that he accepted traditional marriage, and now he has said that he has evolved into accepting the idea of having same-sex marriage be accepted on the same level as straight marriage. In fact, his Department of Justice started off by saying they wouldn't defend DOMA. Now we know the Supreme Court has ruled in 2015 that gay people can get married and should be able to get married under the Constitution. So notice what's happened here. Younger people have now challenged once again the traditionalist order, and we're back into that cultural wars fight between modernists, postmodernists, and traditionalists. On top of this, we've also had a huge problem in the culture between racial fights. This seemed to have been solved to some extent when Obama became president and people began feeling that we might get into a post-racial era. Yet it wasn't. In fact, if anything, we've seen more tension raised over the issues of race. When Obama first became president, there was a Harvard professor who was stopped outside of his house by the police, and this eventually had to be resolved through what was known as the Beer Summit, where Obama met with the professor and the police officer in order to try to intervene between the two. Then we saw the case of Trayvon Martin, who was killed by George Zimmerman in a fight outside of a housing area down in Florida. Michael Harris recently was killed by a police officer in Ferguson. At the end of that, the DOJ, Department of Justice, came out with two reports. One claiming that the police officer, Darren Wilson, would be exonerated and seen as having shot in self-defense. But at the same time, the Department of Justice released another report claiming that the Ferguson police were actually targeting black people in order to raise money in Ferguson, and that was caused the frustration in Ferguson. Then in Baltimore in 2015, a young man was killed in what was called the rough ride. This was basically where people are put into a police car, and they are not seatbelted down, and so as they are driving around, they're thrown around the back. The man actually had his spinal cord ripped apart because of this supposed rough ride, and it led to riots in Baltimore over police brutality. So this leads to the big question at the end. Is there an American ideology? So we've talked about this before in class with different types of historiography, and it comes back now to the modernists, the traditionalists, and the postmodernists. One view is consensus view. Americans generally believe in certain universal principles. These include individual rights, limited government, equal opportunity, and tolerance. Another way is that we are in conflict. Americans may appear on the surface to be united, but we're actually separated by class, gender, sexuality, and race. The argument that we're having today is the question of whether or not inequalities have separated Americans into different communities. Are our differences creating agendas that are then projected through our points of view off of these differences? Or are we united through some type of common overall ideology?